next up, our next presentation is by yours truly, by myself. Just let me remind you, my name is Arturs Lontons. I work as a support engineer at Zabbix, a consultant and a trainer. And I'm going to be covering also another long-awaited feature, which is roles for the enterprise. And we are going to see how these are implemented in 5.2. So let's take a look. So let's talk about user roles. Quite an important feature, something that we have been working on quite a lot, and we are really proud to introduce granular user roles in version 5.2. So first off, let's talk about permission granularity and some scenarios where user roles should be used and where they give a great benefit to these specific environments. So let's take a look. We have two examples. We have our NOC team role, and then we have network administrator role. Quite different roles requiring different permissions, and the people working in these roles usually have different skill sets. So when it comes to UX, it is quite important to both of these roles. While NOC team probably wants to see only the most important, the most vital data, the network administrators are usually interested in more detailed permissions and more detailed information of what's going on in your environment. So let's define the requirements. First, for our NOC team role, they will probably need access to dashboards and maps. We will probably want to restrict unnecessary UI elements for them just to improve the UX. In this case, less is more because they won't be confused by UI elements that they're not using at all, that they haven't learned about, haven't been introduced to. They will just see what they need. At least they want to see what they need. And with 5.2, they also will be able to see the UI that they actually need to see. They need to have restricted API access because very rarely NOC teams actually do need to use API. We will either restrict it partially, most likely we will restrict it completely. Next up, we won't give them the rights to change configuration. Our network admins will be responsible for that, and we won't allow them to close problems manually. Our network admins will also be doing that. All right, now speaking of network admins, let's take a look at what kind of permissions they require. So they, of course, same as the NOC team, they require access to dashboards and maps. They're still interested in the same information, what's going on in your environment, the health of the environment. Maybe those dashboards and maps will be different, but we know that for a while now in Zabbix, we can implement permissions, we can make our dashboards private or public, so that's no problem. Then they need to have access to configuration. They will actually be making configuration changes. And most likely, instead of disabling API access, ideally for our network administrator role, we would want to restrict it in some way. They still have access to maybe get methods or maybe even host create or item create methods, but maybe they don't have access to get the audit log, for example. That's for our networking super admins or monitoring super admins. And ideally, for pretty much every role out there, we want to restrict UI elements. This is for the sake of the UX. Like I said before, less is more, and this pretty much pertains to every role, every user out there. Of course, there are some scenarios where you're using pretty much every element, every part of the UI out there. You have a very complex environment and you're utilizing Zabbix to 110%. In that case, of course, restricting UI is a bad idea. But in most cases, there's something that you're just not using, something that's not vital for your environment. So why have it in UI? You probably want to restrict it. Another quite important use case for roles, now that we're just talking about this kind of generally, is multi-tenancy. So of course we have our permissions. We can restrict permissions per host groups for user groups, and that works fine. But let's say we have a customer portal and we have different tenants. So they're logging in and each tenant has their own requirements. Some want to use the services function for SLA calculation. Others want to use inventory. Others just need the maps and the dashboards. So we also want to restrict that, especially since this is a multi-tenant environment and we definitely cannot predict the familiarity with Zabbix for our different tenants. And if we're, for example, teaching them how to use it, if they have all of these UI sections available for them, that'll be quite complex. So restricting UI is quite vital over here. Next up, of course, each tenant is going to have different monitoring requirements, which we can enable with permissions, specific host groups available, specific dashboards are available, showing problems in a specific way, restricting access to elements and actions. So for example, some tenants can close problems manually, others cannot. Once again, depends on the requirements. And permissions are used to enable isolation between tenants. So now that we have talked about a couple of use cases, a couple of very general use cases, let's talk about 5.2 and how it actually enables these use cases. Even if some of them you were able to almost fully implement in 5.0, 5.2 ramps it up from 90%, let's say, to 100%, so you can fully implement them. So let's see how our new role function and feature can help you to accomplish this. So this is something completely new. User roles in 5.2, this is what they're called. Each user will have a role assigned to them, so not just the user type, but also a user role. And depending on the role, a corresponding type will be assigned. So types are still there, but they are linked to user roles. And user roles are linked to users. So types are linked to users indirectly through the user role. So the old types still remain. We still have user admin and super admin, and role will be linked to one of these three types. They are not going anywhere. We aren't adding new user types. Still the same old user types that you're used to are there. And the rules, the restrictions per user type still apply. And here we can see them. So super admin has access to pretty much everything: administration, configuration, reports, inventory, monitoring. Admin has access to configuration, reports, inventory, and monitoring, so we can see that administration is removed. User has access to reports, inventory, and monitoring. So here for user type, we can see that configuration and administration is removed. This is just kind of calling back to something that you guys are probably already familiar with. And we're just kind of doing some revising over here of already familiar subjects, so you remember what kind of we're talking about when we're talking user types and what kind of restrictions they have. So moving on, once we upgrade to 5.2 or install a fresh 5.2 instance, we will have a set of default user roles. They're available under administration user roles, and there are 4 of them: super admin, admin, user, and guest role. So the default super admin role, I'm calling it default because it's there once you upgrade or install a fresh instance, it is static. So you cannot modify this role. All of the other default roles, they can be changed, but super admin is grayed out. You cannot change what this role is restricted to. It has access to everything. Why? Because think about it. We have a Zabbix environment. We want to have at least a single user with this here super admin role that has access to everything. We must have a super admin, similar to we must have a root user in our Linux OS. So this is pretty much the same use case. Other newly created role types, either of super admin, admin, or user, can be modified, no problem. So we can create another super admin role, change the permissions for it. Let's say we can have a super admin that doesn't have access to administration general, but has access to everything else. That's no problem. The thing is, we just cannot modify this default one role of type super admin. So once we open the user roles section up, we will see a screen with a lot of checkboxes, a lot of drop-down menus, and it's quite fascinating how much we can actually restrict and how granular we can make our roles. Once we create a new role, or if we take a look at our default roles that are pre-created for us, they will pretty much have the maximum allowed permission depending on the user type that is used for the role. So all of the available checkboxes will be checked in, all of the available functionality will be enabled. So let's talk about step by step what we can restrict. First off, we can restrict UI elements. Remember the general use cases that I mentioned before. So we can restrict UI sections. For example, for our NOC users, we can restrict them to have access only to dashboards and maps. And when we open the user up and go to permissions, we will see the available sections highlighted in green. And once we open up our dashboards or our monitoring section, we will actually see only the UI sections in our navigation menu that have been permitted for this specific user. So this is what I was talking about. This is the UX improvement. Less is more. And it's quite nicer that you're seeing, in this case, only what you need to see, what you want to see. You're not seeing any unnecessary functionality. Remember that host group to user group permissions are still there. They're not going anywhere. For example, when we open a dashboard, we will still check, hey, does this user belong to a user group which has access to a specific host group? And then we will either display or hide the corresponding data. So this functionality still remains. It's not going anywhere. Roles is just an addition on top of that. So we talked about restricting UI elements. Next up, let's talk about restricting access to API, which can also be done. So we have an enabled access to API checkbox, which we can either mark or unmark. And depending on that, the corresponding user of this specific role that we are changing right now will either have access to the API or it will be denied. In addition to that, we can allow or restrict the execution of specific API methods. So we have an allow list, or if we want to, a deny list that we can implement for a specific user role. For example, we could create a user that has access only to get methods, nothing else. He can read the data, he cannot modify the data. From the API standpoint, it looks quite self-explanatory. When I execute, for example, a host create method, if I don't have permissions to do so, I will see an error message, no permissions to call, and then the name of the call. In this case, it's host create. So we've talked about UI sections, we've talked about API restrictions. Now let's talk about access to actions. And in this context, actions means what this user can do with the UI. Can he close problems? Can he acknowledge them? Can he create or edit maps? All of this can be restricted per role. One note for example, for user role, the role of type user. The create and edit maintenance will be grayed out because the user type by default doesn't have access to the maintenance section. So it will be grayed out. You cannot enable it for user type, but you can enable it for the admin type or disable it for admin type role, no problem. So maybe you're getting confused here. I'm talking about types and roles. Remember that role is linked to a type. Just something to remember if you want to put this together. So when I'm mentioning a specific type, it means a role that is linked to a specific type. A role that is linked to a user type, it will have create and edit maintenance grayed out. A role that is linked to admin type will be able to create and edit maintenance, or we can restrict it on that role if we want to. Next up, restricting actions. We have an example. Let's say we want to restrict the role for acknowledging and closing problems. So we can do just that. And then in the front end, the acknowledgement and closing of problems will be grayed out. We won't be able to actually do that. Quite self-explanatory. It's grayed out. You don't have access to it. If we enable it, the checkboxes are editable once again. We can acknowledge and close the problem as if we had permissions for that specific user type in 4.0 without any restrictions. So it will look as it looks right now. Another thing that we can do, so we've talked about UI restrictions, API restrictions, and action restrictions. There's also the default access section that we can modify. We can define that this role has default access to new actions, modules, and UI elements. What this means is that, for example, if we are importing a new module, a new front-end module, upgrading our version 5.2 to version 6.0 in the future, if new UI elements appear, or new modules, or new action types appear, do we want for this specific role that we are editing right now to have access to it by default once it is created? Or should by default all of these new elements that we are creating should this role have restricted access to it, so no access to it in this case. So we can decide, yeah, for my super admin users, once a new UI element pops up, I want to give them access to it. For my NOC team, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what new UI elements are going to pop up when I upgrade to 6.0 in the future. So I will restrict it. They won't have access to it. I will enable it per need to execute basis. So after migration to 5.2, you might ask, so how are these roles going to be assigned? I have my users of a specific user type, but what's going to happen with roles? Will I have to assign them manually? Will everything be broken, or what's going to happen? So when you upgrade to 5.2 from, for example, 5.0, the users will have the pre-created default roles for admin, user, and super admin assigned for them. So the default roles that we looked at a couple of slides back, they are going to be assigned to your users, and then you can tweak them, modify them, create new roles and assign these to users and so on. So essentially, when you upgrade to 5.2, if you wish to just leave the old logic in without changing anything, you'll be able to do so. Just don't touch anything, it will work just fine. But if you wish to start restricting things and making things more granular, you can start doing that, no problem. So now that we have gone through the roles, we have talked about the functionality, the features, what can be restricted, how it can be done, let's talk about some example use cases to give you the idea of how you can implement this in your environment. So first off, let's talk about a read-only role. Most likely a NOC team user role with read-only access to dashboards and problems, no access to API, and no permissions to execute front-end scripts. So when we are defining this new role, we will mark the corresponding checkboxes in the monitoring section, and the user type for this role is going to be user because, yeah, they don't need to have access to administration or configuration. We will also restrict the access to the API, and we'll restrict access to actions. And the default actions will also be restricted, the default elements. This user role won't have access to new modules or new UI elements. Or maybe if we want to, we can enable access to new UI elements and disable access to modules, or the other way around. This is pretty much up to you in real life. It's up to discussing with your Zabbix super admins what kind of modules do they plan on implementing. If you read the release notes for Zabbix quite extensively, then you can maybe leave this access to new UI elements in because you're aware of what's coming, and then you're aware if your NOC users will need it. This is pretty much individual on each environment, and you can decide how you want to implement this. So when we log in with this user and we go to dashboards, we will see that, hey, this user has no option to create or edit a dashboard because we have restricted such an action. And the access to dashboards, they do have it, but it's still granted based on the dashboard permissions. Is it a public dashboard? Is it a private dashboard? And of course, when they open it up, the data that they will see will depend on user group to host group relationship. When this user opens up the front end, he will see that also the access to UI elements, the unnecessary UI elements, is restricted. And even though he has access to the problem widget on the dashboard, he is unable to acknowledge or close the problem from it because we have restricted those actions. Next up, another very interesting use case. Maybe I briefly touched upon this before, but we're talking about restricting access to administration sections. Remember, administration sections are available only for our super admins. But in this case, we want to have a separate role of type super admin that has some restrictions. Our role will need to have access to creating and managing proxies, defining media types and front-end scripts, and accessing the queue to check the health of our Zabbix instance. But they won't be able, for example, to create new user groups, users, and so on. So once again, we are opening our administration user roles section, creating a new role of type super admin, and restricting all of the user related things, and also restricting going to administration general. So when we log in, we can see that, yeah, there is no access to administration general section because we didn't want for these admins to maybe change some housekeeper settings or trigger severities or other things that are available in administration general. But we want for them to be able to manage our proxies, media types, scripts, and take a look at the queue. And all of that is available. They are still able to do it. They just don't have access to those sections that we restricted. So really nice, really neat, nice way to create like different types of super admins, which was completely impossible before. Next up, another very interesting and not so niche example, roles for multi-tenant environments. So the example that I have mentioned already, our customer portal, we will have a customer portal that our different tenants access, and then they log into Zabbix, and we'll decide what kind of access do these tenants need to have. So in this specific case, they need to have read-only access to dashboards, maps, no access to API, no access to configuration, and they will need to have isolation per tenant. So we won't be able to see the host status of other tenants. This kind of makes sense, of course. So we will create a new role, once again, administration user roles, new role of type user, and we will restrict access only to the UI elements that we want for these users to see. Then, next up, since we need to have isolation, we will also be using tag-based permissions to isolate our host per tenant. So we'll go to the permission section, we will add read-only or write permissions on a user group to a specific host group. And then we will also define the tag-based permissions that, hey, these users have access only to problems that are tagged with a specific tag. Don't forget to actually tag those problems. We have added the permissions, but we haven't added the tags yet. And this is what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to tag my problems. I'm going to define these tags either on the trigger level or on the host level. So once we have implemented this, if we open up the UI, we go to monitoring dashboards. Yeah, we can see we have access to only the sections that we need to have access to. And we're seeing problems only related to our specific hosts based on their tags, just as we wanted. So isolation has been implemented, role restriction has been implemented. We can successfully have our multi-tenant environment. So now that we have taken a look at these use cases, what's next? How would you proceed with upgrading to 5.2 and implementing this? So at the design stage, you need to understand that user roles can help you with a couple of things, and you need to kind of estimate and assign value to these things if you want to implement them in your environment. So first off, of course, user roles can improve auditing. Since you have restricted roles per each user, for example, it's a lot easier to understand who did what. Restricting API access. So we can not only enable or disable API access, we can restrict our users to specific methods. Once again, from security perspective and from auditing perspective, this is really great and really flexible. Same goes with configuration. We can restrict which user can do what actions, has access to specific configuration sections. Remember the example with the custom super admin role. So this also helps you with auditing, helps you with security, and potentially just makes your Zabbix instance much less messy because people have access only to the things that they need to have access to. And then, of course, UX. Something that I've said before, less is more. Remove unwanted UI elements for users that are not using specific features. Now they don't need to be specialists or professionals. It's still quite recommended if you want to utilize Zabbix to 110%, but not everyone wants to. Some users are just interested in seeing their data, and that's perfectly fine. We have to understand that this is a use case. So for them, we will restrict the UI to only the elements, only the data that they need, thus making their lives so much easier and Zabbix so much more simple for them. Thank you. I hope I gave some insight into how roles can be used and how they will be implemented in 5.2. And I hope you aren't afraid to play around with this and implement them in your environment. Thank you.
All right, who's your host now? Okay, so that was a wonderful presentation from Arturs, but he can't necessarily ask the questions to himself, so allow me to do that for a wonderful speaker. So Arturs, first up, can we have a limited read-only user that will have access to all the hosts that are already in Zabbix and will be added in the future?
Yes and no. To answer the first part of your question, already in Zabbix, yes, we can have access to all of the existing host groups. The thing is, when you add a new one, you will have to then go to your permissions section on the host group and just add it back in, add the host group permission to the user group. So if you see that you have permission to all of the host groups, it's all of the host groups until you add a new one. Then you have to plug it in manually. I think there should be a feature request regarding that, so it's something that we will work on to change in the future.
All right, so second up from the same person. So that means that now we can have a fully customizable multi-tenant environment.
Oh yes, definitely. I think you saw that in my examples in my presentation over here. Yes, fully customizable based on our both permission logic, so user group to host group permissions, and then roles to kind of make the UI and actions and different sections available as per the requirements of our tenants. So the answer is yes, of course.
Very well. Moving on to our next question. Now, I want to create a user with only API access. Is that possible in 5.0 or 5.2?
It's been possible for a while now, I think even in 4.0. You can just disable the front-end access and leave the user with the respective permissions on specific host groups. So you can do it, could do it in the past, you can still do it. Now you can only make the API limitations more granular. So you can say that this API only user has access only to specific API methods. So we kind of improved on it. So yeah,
right on. Okay, and the last question so far is, can we make a user who can see but cannot edit the configuration?
Partially. So if we're talking about read-only users, read-only access still works for the monitoring section, but if we go to configuration, if we want to see anything in the configuration section, we need write access. Now you have monitoring hosts where you can kind of see some of the configuration in that monitoring host section, so that's available to read-only users. Configuration, unfortunately, still is not. It requires write permissions. So once again, I have checked our bug tracker and feature request tracker for a feature request like so. It's there. Feel free to leave a vote, leave a comment, and hopefully we will make those necessary changes sometime in the nearby future, and we'll find a way to implement this requirement.
Hopefully, or rather, absolutely.
Exactly.
Okay, so thank you, Arturs, very much. That was an awesome presentation. As always, one of my favorite speakers, hands down. So what's going to happen now is we're going to take a short 10-minute break. Meanwhile, I would highly recommend that you actually check out the sales chat room, the partners, the tech corner, and also our sponsors, because those are going back online as well. So 10 minutes, use them wisely, and make sure to ask more questions if you are so inclined to do so. All right, see you soon.